Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 12th, 1870, Utah grants women the right to vote. Now, the women of Utah weren't technically the first to be given this right in the United States. Wyoming had just passed a law a few months before, but women in Utah were the first to actually cast ballots just a couple days after this law took hold in the Salt Lake City municipal election. It is quite the milestone, but also a little bit of a enjoy it while it lasts moment, because one of the things we're going to be talking about on today's episode is the fact that 17 years later, Congress took back the right of women to vote in Utah, and they no longer had representation. So let's talk about it. And as we will discuss, a lot of this was tied up into very Utah-y questions about the Church of Latter-day Saints and polygamy and lots more. So really fascinating story. Here to discuss Utah's give and take on women's suffrage are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So we'll talk about the take in a little bit, but let's talk about the give. Why is Utah out front in this way? I think we did an episode about Wyoming doing this, and it was a little surprising. We talked about why some of the frontier states were out front in this. What is our sense of why Utah is, all the way back in 1870, granting the right to women to vote?
So part of it has to do with these issues around the Church of Latter-day Saints, around issues of polygamy. There was a real resistance outside of Utah to allowing Utah to become a state, in large part because of this practice of polygamy that was legal in the Utah territory. And Congress was trying to figure out a way for Utah to give up its practice of polygamy. And so they had this bright idea, hey, if we let women vote in Utah, clearly, they are going to vote against the practice of polygamy. That's going to be our kind of backdoor to outlawing polygamy, and then everything will be great. Utah gets to become a state. Everybody wins. Doesn't quite work out as planned, but that was the big scheme.
Yeah, and I also think that people thought that maybe it might work in another direction, that, oh, okay, if we give women the right to vote, then maybe this will catch on and other states will want to do the same thing.
So, you know, there's a lot that's sort of interesting in the specific way that this right is granted to women. I think one important thing to point out is there's no secret ballot here. And so all of a sudden you have suffrage, you have the ability to vote. Also, I'll just say, I'm struck by this timing. February 12th, they passed this law, and then February 14th is the election. Just it all feels like it's happening fast. It all feels like,
ladies, get it together.
Yeah, exactly.
You're voting.
and oh yeah, now here's an entirely new world, and we're asking you to do this upend the sort of life that we've known. And by the way, all of your neighbors will be able to see how you're voting, or at least you'll be watched as you vote.
I don't know that you would necessarily get a different result with a secret ballot, but I do think it's very important to note that is what's happening, that there's the possibility of real social sanction if you cast a ballot to outlaw polygamy, because it had been a practice that was core to the Mormon community in Utah. It had, in fact, in some ways become a particular identifier because there were so many attacks against it. When the Republican Party is founded in 1856, it is founded to end the relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. So it had been really in the sights of reformers outside of Utah for a very long time.
And people went to Utah to find safe haven, to get to a space where they could practice their religion without oversight or without scrutiny. And so a lot of people saw Utah as that safe space in order to practice polygamy. And so to put it on the ballot, the first attempt is you're asking someone to go against their religion the moment they get a chance to sort of have a say politically.
Yeah. And, it is also the case that within the church itself, there was an interesting sort of relationship with women's rights and women's and the church's attitude towards suffrage. I mean, Mormon women had been allowed to vote on congressional matters for about 40, 50 years at this point, although their votes were largely there to sustain decisions and they were made in private. But, I just think that there's so many more kind of there's so many more layers and nuance to the dynamic here, including, we should also just say, as this law gets passed, I mean, we think suffrage, like you flip a switch. It is not just flipping a switch. I mean, the language is very clearly, it's like every woman of the age of 21 years who has resided in this territory 6 months next preceding any general special election, born or naturalized in the United States, or who is the wife, widow, or daughter of a native born or naturalized citizen of the United States. Obviously, when you're tying it to citizenship in this era, there's all sorts of other things going on there. So, yeah, it just feels very fraught, even though it is momentous.
Wow.
And it also calls attention to the way that I think we often think of like the expansion of the franchise as something that is benevolent and beneficent, and that is tied to the recognition of the humanity and the equality of the people who are getting the vote. And you look at a case like this and you're like, oh, they're just trying to manipulate people in order to get the outcome that they want. And none of this seems to be tied to like, oh, women are equal citizens. We should give them a voice in their representation. That doesn't seem to be part of the conversation at all in this case.
Yeah.
No. And I mean, the stipulation too, that like you can vote if you're a woman, if you're 21, even if you're not a citizen, if you're the wife of a citizen, you can vote, which I think is interesting. This is very much about like your political enfranchisement is always tethered to marriage in some sort of way, that like your husband's or the status of having a husband is somehow a referendum on your ability to have a voice.
I believe that this is true in citizenship law in the U.S. more generally in this period, where maybe a little bit earlier, but if a man were to marry a non-U.S. citizen woman, he could lose his citizenship. I'm not sure how, or no, if a woman married a man without citizenship, she could lose her citizenship. And
then lose her right to vote.
It's that's wild.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Citizenship follows the husband.
I know. It's just, talk about the patriarchy.
Well,
don't we always?
But that also ties into, I think, one of the larger elements of the story too, which is this idea that rights can be granted and rights can be taken away, right? And that you don't just we tend to think of like it's just a step forward, but it's often a step forward, 2 steps back, or whatever. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So that's the second part of this story, is that 17 years later, women in Utah lose the right to vote, even though they've been granted it. And it's not within Utah. It is more Congress. It is more Washington, D.C. looking and saying, no, this won't fly.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
You can never sort of really roll back these rules once you have granted someone a particular freedom. Then to try to take it away, it just does not work. And it didn't sit well with women that had been enfranchised, and now all of a sudden it's like, well, if you're not going to vote the way we want you to vote, then you shouldn't vote. Like, is voting about what you want, or is voting about democracy? Of course, I mean, like, we know the answers, but it's just, it feels very manipulative when you realize that these privileges, quote unquote, are contingent upon like enacting in behavior that the federal government would sanction.
And this is partly due to the fact that Utah is still a territory in this period, and they are still fighting over this issue of polygamy. And so Congress votes in 1887 in the Edmunds-Tucker Act to take away the rights of Utah women to vote, whether or not they were Mormon, whether or not they were polygamous or monogamous. And understandably, as Kellie was saying, people were pretty upset. Women were upset that they had been able to practice this right of citizenship for, at that point, 17 years, which is a very long time. And it is also interesting to me that this is happening kind of contiguously with the passage of segregation laws and the passage of disenfranchisement laws in the U.S. South, that there's this experience that's happening in a lot of different parts of the country, that people once had rights that are now being taken away. Chinese immigration is being rolled back at this time. So there's a way in which there's a kind of hardening of or retrenchment that's happening in politics.
Can I just say, if there's a time period I'm not going back to, it's the 1890s. Like the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, like every like progressive moment gets rolled back, gets undone, gets reversed, tramped on. Like it just was not a good time to be a person of color, not a good time to be a woman. And it's never a good time to be poor. But like all of this moment here, I think is so emblematic of where the country was, which is in like a full out almost rebellion against anything progressive.
Yeah. So 1887 is when you get this law that rescinds the right to vote for women in Utah. And, it's about polygamy, but it's every woman in Utah no longer has the right to vote. But then, pretty quickly things start to change again, because in 1890, the LDS church president officially ends the practice of polygamy, which is really the sort of crux issue in all of this. And pretty quickly after that, 4 years later, Congress formally invites Utah to again apply to enter as a state, and the state constitution comes together at that point. And in the state constitution, I think in part because there's large public support for women voting because of what people who were still alive had seen, it is put into the state constitution, and so Utah kind of still comes back again with being, I think, a little bit of a leading indicator on that front.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it joins a number of others we've talked about before, Western states that are passing suffrage laws that welcome women to vote in those states, and becomes the leading region of the country for this progressive suffrage movement in many ways. But yeah, a little toggling back and forth for Utahns and their ability to vote.
Yeah, but they're still waiting another 20, 30 years.
That's true.
I mean, like, it's still, until the rest of the country, can vote, it's still at least another 30 years.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know. It's so funny when you think about like how time and progress works. If you were to tell someone, who was 21 in this moment, who gets the chance to vote, and then say they're, in their 30s or whatever when it gets taken away, and you won't get it back again until your 60s, if you should live that long, it's wild.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks to the folks who have recommended this. We've gotten a couple emails about this one, so I'm glad we got around to it. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.